Hey guys, it's Mr. Miles. I just wanted to try out something for Mythology Club. So I'm trying this thing out. It's called, I don't know what I'm going to call it. Maybe the Miles Files or the Miles Mythology Minute, something. I don't know. I'll find a name for it. But I just wanted to make some videos about topics that uh, you have maybe expressed interest in or I find interesting, just any combination of which. Uh, I just want to sort of add things to the Google Classroom to make it less lonely and full of cobwebs and try to give you guys something to chew on and just talk about because that's part of the fun about this whole mythology club thing is just that we can get together, we can geek out about stuff like this. So today I just figured I'd kick it off with something that I have been doing some research on and I just find incredibly interesting, and who knows, maybe you'll find incredibly interesting too. So the question for today is, who is the Norse god of the sea? And I want to say that my first year here at Bremen, I had a student ask me that question. He wasn't in my mythology class. He was just one of my students in one of my English classes, and he knew I was a mythology teacher. And so I think we were talking about Beowulf and going over Norse mythology. And he asked me, Mr. Miles, who is the Norse god of the sea? And for a seemingly simple question, I found myself sort of speechless because I didn't know how to answer it. Because he asked it like it was like you know, what is the square root of 19, right? Like there was one answer to it. Um, because we're sort of trained up, I believe, in this Western civilization to, you know, treat gods as each one has their own little domain. Like Zeus, god of thunder; Poseidon, god of the sea; uh, Demeter, goddess of the harvest; so on and so forth. Like everybody has their own little niche that they fall into, and that's it. Nobody really ever sort of goes outside of it. And everybody has nice, clean little categories and boxes that they fit into. And that's not exactly how it works with most religions. But that's sort of just the way that we are trained to learn about it from a young age. And the thing is with Norse mythology is that it's not that simple. It's not as easy as just saying, "Oh well, it's Poseidon; he's the god of the sea," right? In Greek mythology, it's pretty straightforward. Now you can have an I could make a whole nother video like this about who is the god of the sea in Greek mythology, um, because yes, it's Poseidon, but there's also like 50 other gods of the sea who are kind of lesser versions of Poseidon. But here, this is a weird question because there is no great answer to this question. And I just wanted to give you some food for thought and basically give you a little bit of a rundown as to why this question, which on the surface seems so simple and so easy and so answerable, but in reality is actually one of the hardest questions to answer because the answer could be, I'm about to give you three candidates. The answer could be one of these following three candidates. It could be all of the following three candidates, or it could be none of them. So, yeah, mythology. So, let me just go into the start of it. So, like I said, if I was asked this question about Greek mythology, I would have a very quick, canned response. The god of the sea is Poseidon. Easy. Norse mythology is weird. It is not that clearly demarcated. And part of the problem is probably because we don't have as much on Norse mythology as we do on Greek mythology. Greek mythology, we have tons of information on it. Like the Greeks love to write down stuff about what they believed. The Norse liked to pass it down orally, which is, you know, great for their culture in their time period, but not so great for posterity. So who are our candidates? Well, first we have Ire. I believe the correct pronunciation of his name is Ire, but I've been pronouncing it Iger this whole time. Uh, so Ire is a sea giant, and most translations of his name mean sea giant. Although another translation of his name, I think that's like more of the like old Germanic version of his name, means waterman, which I find really funny. Um, but the problem is, if his name literally means sea giant, then does that not exclude him from being a god? Because are not giants and gods different things? And that's where we get into a whole nother question, because it's sort of a similar question to the whole, well, the gods and the titans are different things in Greek mythology. But if we're being totally honest with ourselves, they're really not, because titans are just the forerunners of the actual gods, who are gods only because they won the war, right? The winners write the history books, and the gods who win the primordial battle at the beginning of creation are the ones who get to call themselves gods. And then the losers have to be called something else. So Ire is a sea giant, not a sea god. But is there really a difference? Well, he has a lot of things that go in his favor. Um, he hangs out in the sea. He hangs out with the gods frequently. The gods, there's quite a few myths of the gods going down to Ire's place and partying up with him at the bottom of the sea. Um, he has 9 daughters who are literally the just personification of waves. Um, and so, like, he, even though we don't know a ton about him, could be a contender for God of the Sea, but we just don't know that much about him. Also, the fact that he is called a sea giant means maybe he's not exactly the candidate that we're looking for here. And also, if you go and you look through some of the kennings that survive through poetry and through the Eddas and things like that that refer to Ire, the only ones that talk about Ire, the only kennings that we have of him, just talk about his ability to bring alcohol to a party. They call him the bringer of ale, or the, what's the other one, the bringer of mash, or just all the kennings talk about his ability to bring liquor to the gods with his big pot of ale, and that's it. Like, there's really nothing else they talk about with him, so it's hard to say what to do with Ire. Now, Ire also has our second contender. We have Ran, who is Ire's wife, but she does have a kind of distinct personality from Ire. If Ire is sort of like the happy, let's get turnt and let's have a great time sea god, if we're going to call him one, Ran is sort of the sinister, dark sea god, because obviously these Vikings were going from place to place in their longships. They were afraid of the sea. Oftentimes they'd sink, oftentimes they'd drown. Ran was the one who supposedly would take them down in her net. She would have a net, and she would drag them down to the bottom of the sea, where apparently there was an afterlife for people who drowned. So, and this place is distinct from Valhalla. It's distinct from Hell. It's distinct from Folkvanger, where Freya takes her half of the slain. Um, we don't know what the name of this place is, but apparently there was a distinct afterlife for specifically drowned men. Um, and Ran was the one who ruled it, essentially. And, she would, it's this sort of sinister figure, sort of lurking beneath the waves, waiting to just snatch people down and drag them under. Uh, Kind of like, Davy Jones, take him to Davy Jones's locker. Her name literally means robber, right? So that's kind of the imagery that you have of her, but that's really all we know about her, and so it doesn't really seem to make her a very strong contender for the God of the Sea. So that brings us to our last contender, who is Njord. Um, And Njord, I think, is probably, if you just want to not get into a 30-minute discussion with somebody over it, and they just want an easy, simple, clean answer that's going to be the most correct, Nord would probably be the one I would go with, right? When somebody asks me who is the Norse god of the sea, I would probably go with Njord. And there are reasons why I would hesitate to do that, but we'll get into that. Um, so why would he be the strongest candidate of the three? Well, first off, he's a Vanir, and that's important because if you remember the distinction between the Aesir, which is one group of gods, and the Vanir, which is another group of gods, the Aesir are gods of war and government, essentially, if you want to boil it down, very simple. The Vanir are essentially gods of fertility, right, slash nature. And so that associates Njord with an element or an aspect of nature. Um, he lives in a place also in the sea. This place actually is named. It's called Noatun, which means literally ship town or shipburg. So there you go. Snorri, who is essentially our best source for a lot of this stuff, literally says that he rules the seas. So that's a big plus in his favor. Um, we have lots of evidence of basically ship uh, sailors and fishermen and people who would go on ships calling out to him for help or for protection while they would go from place to place. So, like, essentially, if you were a sailor in the Norse part of the world, you would call on Njord for help. We have evidence that backs that up. So, there's a lot of stuff to back up Njord as sort of the de facto god of the sea. This is kind of the one that we can point to. So, why am I so hesitant to say that this guy is the god of the sea? Well, there's all those feathers in his cap. You can't take those away from him. But what if I told you that Njord, as he currently exists, or as he exists at least in the Eddas that Snorri wrote down, what if I told you that Njord was not always Njord? What if I told you that Njord was actually not always a god of the sea, but actually used to be a goddess of the earth? You heard me right. I said goddess of the earth. So this is where we talk about Nerthus. So Nerthus is the Latin spelling of the name. If you actually write out Nerthus's name in old, well, in this case it would be Germanic, it's essentially the same word as Njord. And the gender is left ambiguous. And by that I mean you could make it feminine, you can make it masculine. Nerthus is traditionally, I believe it's Tacitus, the Roman writer who recorded it, is traditionally called a woman, a female goddess, right? Who had a very powerful, popular cult in Scandinavia in like way before the Vikings, like Roman times. And she was an earth goddess, a fertility goddess, an earth goddess. And there was like this very long, elaborately described ritual for the worshippers of Nerthus that Tacitus describes, where basically there's a big old cart and this sort of effigy, this sort of statue of Nerthus that you see right here, is drawn on one big long parade throughout Germany until it's taken to an island where it's ritualistically cleaned by a bunch of slaves, and then all the slaves are drowned. And we just know that by doing that, it would like promise fertility for the crops and the yield for that year, supposedly. So that's what we know about Nerthus. And a lot of scholars seem to think that what happened in the case of Njord is something very similar to what happened with Poseidon in Greek mythology. So let me just sort of recap the reasons for why these sort of mythology detectives think that essentially Nerthus went from being a goddess of the earth to being a god of the sea. So again, I talked about the names. The names are virtually identical. You have the yearly ritual that involves Nerthus, and the ritual involves drowning the slaves. The actual specific method of how these uh, victims are sacrificed is actually very important. Look, like in Celtic mythology, there was a god who was named Essus, and he was essentially like a god of war. He's kind of the Romans associated him with Mars or Ares, and the way that people would sacrifice to Essus, one of the Celtic gods of war, is by slitting their throats. It would involve blood. Um, One of the ways that the Celts would sacrifice to the god of the tribe is by hanging, and so on and so forth. Like the specific ways that you were executed sort of mattered. Um, like the Celtic god of thunder, they would burn people alive, right? Like lightning burns, right? Um, and so the fact that they were drowned hints that there is a sort of pre-programmed, pre-existing relationship with water for Nerthus. Um, Now, kind of the biggest piece for these mythology detectives is the fact that there's a lot of place names um, that are named after Njord in Scandinavia. I mean, it's, you know, you have one of the most popular gods, right? You're going to name a place after him eventually. You go to England and you run into all sorts of places named after Thor, Odin, so on. But if you actually look at the geography of it, Njord has a ton of cult places in like Western Norway, right on the coast. But he also has a ton of cult locations in inland Sweden, which the first part makes sense. Western Norway is on the water. It's one of the longest coastlines of any country, right? Yeah, you would expect there to be a lot of places named after the god of the sea there. But why would there be a ton of places in the middle of landlocked Sweden named after a god of the sea? That would be like, again, Villarica being named after Poseidon, right? Like, what sense would that make? And the explanation that these people are giving is because the names are so linguistically similar, that what probably happened was that the cult of Nerthus, who was a goddess of fertility and of the earth, sort of like a Norse Demeter, migrated, and the cult moved from the middle of Sweden to western Norway to where it eventually spread along the coast of Norway. And obviously, since it was in contact with the water, it became less of a need for us to worry so much about Nerthus, and the god eventually evolved into a god, Njord. Um, and so this is essentially the exact same thing that happened with Poseidon. Most scholars agree that Poseidon was not always a sea god. Poseidon started out as a god of people living in the steppes, people living in these like great big grassy plains, and then eventually they migrated down to the coast of Greece to where obviously everything was on the water. So we should probably have a sea god to help us out here, since we're going to be on the water a lot. And so Poseidon's association with horses remained with him, even though he became a god of the sea. And obviously, you don't see a ton of horses on the water. But the fact that he originated in the plains, in the great fields and the steppes of northeastern Europe, because of that, Poseidon is still associated with horses. Okay, that sort of ancestral memory. And we think that something very similar happened with Nerthus. Um, so Oh, and the one last thing. Another thing is that Snorri says that Njord can control the seas and the storms and or like the winds that would like sink ships and stuff and all the stuff that you would expect for a sea god. But then he just throws in there Snorri that he also controls fire. And I don't know about you, but it seems like a very sort of odd thing for a sea god to be also able to control fire. Uh, but if you consider the possibility that Njord was probably a fertility goddess back in the day, then it makes more sense because, well, what do you do with a field that needs to sort of be like shocked into rejuvenation? You literally shock it. You zap it with lightning. Lightning, um, whether it's nature causing a crop field to burn and renew the soil, or controlled burning, where you literally set your own field on fire to rejuvenate the soil and the nutrients in it. Fire has a very deeply important connotation when it comes to fertility, when it comes to crops, when it comes to the earth. And so if you associate Nord with Nerthus, then it all of a sudden makes a ton of more sense. Oh, well, Nerthus is associated with fire. And since Nerthus eventually evolved into Njord, well, then boom. It makes a ton of sense why you would have the association with fire. Um, and it might also explain the whole thing about Njord having pretty feet. If you want to take that aspect of it too, going back to the fact that maybe Njord was originally a goddess. I mean, it's not to say that men can't have pretty feet, but it could be another explanation for that. Although I like the explanation that that he's in the water all the time, so his feet is his feet are smooth. So to summarize everything, what is the best answer to the question, who is the sea god of Norse mythology? If I had a gun to my head, I would say Njord. But it's just a very loaded question because it's also the answer to the question they don't ask, which is who's the oldest earth goddess potentially in Norse mythology? Also Njord. So next time somebody asks you, assuming that ever happens in your life, may not happen in your life, but it could happen if somebody just stops you at the subway station and is like, "Hey, who's the Norse god of the sea?" You could answer, "Well, it's Njord." But did you also know that Njord is also probably the oldest Earth goddess in Norse mythology too? And see the reaction. But anyway, so that's the Miles Mythology Minute that probably lasted about 20 minutes, but hopefully that's gave you something interesting to think about. So, uh, if there's something that you want me to go over next week, just let me know and I'll try to make a video about it like this if you like this and want me to keep doing it. All right. Have a great night.